Taking It to the Streets is all about advancing firefighter safety and operational integrity for the fire service through provocative insights and dynamic discussions dedicated to both the art and science of firefighting and the traditions of the fire service. The focus at Taking It to the Street continues to be straightforward, street-level talk with intelligent, stimulating, and provocative insights and dynamic discussion with interactive dialogue and, most importantly, listener participation. Just like around the kitchen table or in the day room over a cup of coffee at 02:30 after a good run. And now, the latest edition of Taking It to the Streets with your host, Christopher Naum.
All right, welcome to this edition of the Buildings on Fire podcast, On Your Street and First Due. I'm your host, Christopher Naum. We're continuing our multiple part series here on row houses. We started talking about earlier this year about some of the challenges, construction, operational, lessons, learnings, and continuing issues that are challenging us both at the tactical and at the command level, and certainly in the house and in the streets when we talk about some of the issues that are out there. For those of you that, again, may not remember or have not taken part in our previous series, part one of our program, we got into the insights on row house challenges, talked about construction, operations, and some lessons and learnings, especially out of a series of a number of events that are going back all the way to the early 2000s, but certainly over the last 20 years, there have been a number of events, more importantly, within the last 2 to 3 years, a number of row house related occupancies and incidences that have resulted in some very undesirable outcomes, but certainly a tremendous degree of lessons and learnings that we need to internalize to be able to make us better in the streets tomorrow. Part two of our series dealt with the row house challenges and the predictability of building performance, which is very pronounced. It's very specific. If we have some insights and learnings, our part three of our series was the discussion points on building construction and building anatomy. We got into the weeds quite a bit and talked about the variety of different building types that are common, whether we talk about Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia, Boston, New York City, New Jersey, and the tri-state areas, but certainly throughout the Northeast, we have some very common types of row house and row frame footprints, construction materials. There's certain considerations. More importantly, there are very specific types of characteristics that many of you that are working the jobs in your various locales are very familiar with, and again, have incorporated very specific types of operational parameters, templates, and profiles, predictabilities, and operational insights that are inherent to what we do, sometimes on auto drive. But the biggest challenge, again, as we're going to get into this discussion with our panels, is that we have to be much more cautious and really fine-tune how we are gathering data, building intel, internalizing the things that we're viewing, our reads on the fire ground, communications, and the things that just our gut is telling us that aren't quite right. And sometimes that is part of experience. We talk about that gut shot when we're putting some things together, and I think our panel here today is going to give us some exceptional insights. So part four of our series here on this episode of our Buildings on Fire podcast, dealing with our row house insights. It's really focusing in on operations. We actually have a 2-alarmer program here with 2 separate segments. Our first alarm segment is really going to take a look at the tactical perspectives and street views from a command officer's perspective, but again, talking about tactics, operations, and pulling some things together. I'm going to introduce our panelists here in a moment. And then our second alarm segment, which is part 2 of our part 4 series. So our front end portion here is going to be talking about our tactical perspectives, and then we're going to talk a little bit further on the second part of tonight's segment, dealing with command perspectives, and we have a couple of other guests that we'll roll into. But again, fortunately, based on scheduling and some other aspects here, I've got 2 great guys that certainly are good friends of the American Fire Service. I've got Chief Tony Carroll, retired BC out of the District of Columbia, Fire and EMS, and currently Deputy Chief in Leusa County Fire and Rescue in Virginia. Tony, thank you so very much for being here. And the often imitated but never duplicated Battalion Chief Brian Bassinelli out of Harrisburg, PA, Bureau of Fire. 2 great guys that I've known for a lot of years, and I certainly want to thank you. I know Tony's up at the NFA up in Emmitsburg, and Brian, you're somewhere out off the grid, but certainly available to us here tonight for our episode. So I want to thank you guys for taking time out of your schedules to be with us here. So let's get this thing rolling here. I don't want to further delay some really good conversation. So we've talked about the characteristics of row houses, which are as common as weeds out in the grass, right? And we all have a variety of different types, whether we talk about the row frames or the row houses with our brick and joist or our frame construction. Many of us, again, and certainly you guys have seen some of those challenges firsthand from those perspectives. The one thing I wanted to make note of for our audience and our panelists here, we were discussing this just as we were preparing to go live here for our recording. But in our part one program, and we got into a little bit more in part two also, but in our part one program, when we talked about challenges, construction, ops, and learnings, we actually had communicated and offered some insights on some original research that we had conducted on row houses. And as it rolls into our conversation here on this episode, I want to give our audience a couple of data points. When we take a look at all of the, unfortunately, the limited near misses and the line of duty deaths from a variety of different events going back to from the early 2000s to the most recent events of information from 2024, 20% of those events and incidences that were captured had dominant issues dealing with command, management, and operations. The other significant data point dealing with 26% of issues affecting or influencing fireground operations and outcomes related back to building characteristics and the tactics that were being deployed. So command, the management, the operations, building considerations, characteristics, and tactical deployments, again, of which there were some other subsets, but those related back to 46% of the outcomes of those events. So with that being said, Chief Carroll, what's your insights? What's your first impression? So when we talk about this whole challenging issue in today's fireground, what are the issues that are out there from your perspective? From back in the day all the way to today.
Wow. I mean, I guess we talked about before, we kind of mentioned that, the autopilot thing, right? And I definitely think row houses, because, that is that's the majority of the firefight, I think, in DC and maybe in the places that have these things, you do get to operate on that autopilot thing. So we have to kind of pull back the reins a little bit and ensure that, right, we're being efficient, we're doing it the best way. We're not just on autopilot, that people are taking in information. I think that's, again, also the one of the things I see. I just a friend of mine, a guy with 25 years, just retired, right? And I'm seeing that now. We have a bunch of people that were hired at that time, so we're going to have that brain drain that's going to leave, and all of the institutional knowledge that were raised in these kind of buildings is going to start to move out, and we're going to lose that. I mean, maybe that's a good thing, right? So we don't get fixated and we're not on autopilot. So I mean, so I don't know how to weigh that on the scale of good or bad, right? We're losing the institutional knowledge, but we're also losing the autopilot thing, maybe. So that may be my issue, is getting people the knowledge so that they can make the best decisions. We recently had a Mayday incident in Louisa County, and again, it was a good, solid fire officer, and he made a decision, I think, that was inappropriate, right? And the decision that probably should have been made was to start the firefight from the outside. And one of the comments was, "Oh, if we're going to be that fire department," well, again, I'm not telling you it has to start from the outside, but I want to load you up with information. I want to load you up with information so that the scales will tip in your favor. And the same thing with that's why this show is so good, right? Because we're going to give people more information about this this fire hazard in their community to be able to arm themselves with more information to safely and effectively fight this fire. Did that answer the question? I mean, it's definitely kind of.
No, actually, no. I mean, you're just setting ourselves up for some further items. Brian, what's your perspective on that? What are the challenges out there currently, as Tony just got into? Which again, there's a number of things that we're going to sort of touch upon here. But when we talk about the loss of institutional knowledge, experience issues, it's the one thing that, again, the common theme to our conversations here in row houses, that they're simple operations, right? We're dealing with the footprints of structures, whether they be typically 2 or 3 stories, but relatively small in size, compact in nature. Stretch a couple of lines, go in, do our work, multiple company operations. There's sometimes not a lot of thinking, but as we're sort of laying this out, there has to be a tremendous amount of critical thinking. I'll throw that portion of it in. So, Brian, what's your take on where we're going?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I agree with Chief Carroll. I think that rowhouse fires can be easy until they're not. And we have to recognize that the not is developing, right? So we can go typically on autopilot. We follow our SOPs. We can deploy very similarly from incident to incident. But we can't be so comfortable with that we're disregarding the information that the fire is sending right to us, right? We still have to be on the ball, watching the fire development, watching the smoke development, understanding the construction, or maybe even the modifications, identifying the modifications, looking for that. And so I think that's real important. The other thing that I think that's happening with row houses now, the legacy style row houses, when we look at them, they're 150, 200 years old, and they're starting to time out just because they've been around so long. So now we're starting to run into situations where we don't know what we don't know. We can understand the construction. We can understand the modifications. We can understand some of the challenges that modern living bring as far as hoarding or, that kind of thing. But what we don't know a lot of times is the degradation of the structure itself, simply because it's 100 or 200 years old, water damage, rot, that kind of stuff. So we're starting to deal with that. And I've started to see some of those structural failures kind of post fire that, this was here prior to the fire, but we didn't know it until afterwards. So I think that's something that's developing. But I think one of the biggest challenges too is what Chief Carroll said, like we're getting that turnover, and we have to pass that institutional knowledge on so that the guys that are coming in now, can benefit from that and understand why we do what we do and why it works and what doesn't work. So I think those are some of the big things that are happening right now that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, some really, really great insight. I think, again, we've had these conversations in some other programs on construction and so forth, and we alluded to a little bit of it on our building construction segment. We have been so used to being programmed in reading and sizing up certain characteristics of the buildings that were very common in a different era of time. And now we are suddenly looking at reprogramming and reprioritizing some of the things that now are becoming, instead of being extraordinary and out of the ordinary in the past, are now becoming much more common. I think that one of the things that I'm seeing relative to some research with row house and row frames is the vulnerability toward either compromise or premature collapse. Those typically were more common under degraded conditions over the longevity of a fire. So if we had something that was a little bit more challenging, we've got a multiple alarm, we've got fire extension, we weren't overly concerned about premature collapse until a certain point in the tactical window. Now, sometimes we've got to be concerned about that just as we're stepping off of the rigs and going through the threshold of that doorway with doing the size of getting to the rear of the building, identifying pre-incident intel, or more importantly, as unfortunately with some of the other more recent events, there's things that are presenting themselves right in front of us, but we are not seeing them. So, we talk about sizing up and reading the building. We are just not comprehending some critical building performance characteristics in a variety of fashions, whether it be perimeter walls, interior conditions upon entry, roof conditions, what have you. We're just not making that connection. And a lot of it is just because we're not programming to think about the importance of those. Or I'll throw this in, we're not gaining some of the lessons and learnings pre-incident in the training environment. So I'll lead you into this thing. So we talk about the loss of knowledge due to turnover, trying to gain that street level experience at the company level with newly promoted company officers or newly promoted command officers. We have a little bit of insights tactically, operationally, but I'll ask you this: when was the last time you have seen, and again, you guys may have done it in your departments, but globally, are we seeing enough training or lessons and learnings, construction, whatever it may be, even tactics, on the row house occupancy and building type? Or is it defaulting back to a locale, a company, a particular battalion or district, whether it be Harrisburg, DC, or Jersey City, or Boston, or New York, wherever? Is it a company first to area specific kind of issue, or are we missing the boat without focusing in on these building and occupancy types from a training perspective? Are we keeping up with what's changing, Brian, as you just mentioned?
I think that I think the overall answer to that is probably no. We could do a better job at that, and I think one of the reasons, I can't speak for Chief Carroll, but for us, our district is predominantly made up of row houses, duplexes, and singles, a very similar construction. And I think we get really comfortable because that is our district. There's not a tremendous amount of diversity in those buildings. So we probably don't spend as much time as we should on the buildings that we're really going to fight the fires in the most. I think the fire service tends to gravitate towards the things that we don't do so much. And we feel like we need to talk about those things because they don't happen that often. In the meantime, they don't happen that often. Yes, we do need to talk about that, but we do need to talk about and be very comfortable with the fires that we're going to on the regular. And so I think overall, I would say no, we probably should be spending a lot more time breaking down these incidents and really studying not only our own, but other departments' incidents in the similar construction, and really getting an understanding of how the modern world is affecting these buildings that have been around for so long that we're so comfortable in.
Well, I think, right? Our training, we can't, there's no way for us to really capture training in a 100-year-old row house, right? And I go back, I was fortunate enough to get some OGAT in those buildings, right? And now with incidents going down, and we've talked about this with every kind of fire, right? Because the numbers of fires are going down. So, right, we lose that OGAT, we lose that ability. So, again, right, we take advantage of it during a EMS call, but the building's not coming down in an EMS call. I can't tear open the wall and show you, what a fire cut looks like. I can't do that on an EMS call. I did those things during a fire, and we might take the 3rd or 4th due company, or even, rookies at the training center. Hey, come out to this fire today, right? And I'll show you around. So, and then we're not going to build our burn buildings like a row house. We might build compartments in there, and this is tough because I did think, right, when you called me and said, hey, we're going to talk about row houses, what's there to talk about? Because these fires are so predictable and they're so easy to do when they go right. And 90% of the time it goes right. When I think the time when it doesn't is there's something wrong, right? Again, like there's something out of the ordinary. We had a fire in DC one night in a big row house. It was 3 stories and it was a wide one, right? Well, it had been renovated and they took out the floor for 2 of the floors. So it had a big open living area, right? So the fire behavior was totally different in that building. And the layout was totally different in that building, which caused a close call, if you will. So again, that was out of the ordinary. So it threw us a curveball, and it was different for us. I mean, again, it wasn't necessarily a bad incident. It was just a lot of fire, and the civilians burned up in the thing, but it was out of the ordinary. And those are the ones, right, where they get us into trouble. Like Brian said, they're good until they're not good.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say, and again, I love that whole aspect, easy until they're not. And I think both of your departments and in many other instances, I think there's more of a tendency to have conversations at the kitchen table, at the company level, versus any of this stuff elevating and escalating back up to the training divisions, because of the challenges and the limitations of time in the focal point on whatever the topical areas may be. Traditionally, these building types are what they are. They are consistent in many jurisdictions, daily response cycles, the types of tactics and operations, and things are easy until they're not. And I think the gap continues to be these lessons and learnings. We're just not conversing about what's going on across the United States or across the Northeast, or from the northeastern portion of here of the U.S. I mean, there's such a dramatic amount of things: the near misses, the close calls, the unusual things, whether it be from Boston to Baltimore, and then East Coast to West Coast. And again, we always have those things. And Brian, you made mention before we got online here about an unusual circumstance that, again, didn't sort of fall into the template of what we are consistently experiencing. And explain a little bit about what happened on your particular job there.
What I was saying was we had an incident that was just 2 blocks from the firehouse. And I think that's its own thing that we could talk about someday. Is the closer the fire is to the fire station, the more complicated it is, because we don't have the time to go through our own processes, and we're already on scene. And that's just a little anecdote that I think is interesting, that I wish that I could figure out how to study more intently. But so we had a fire in a row house, middle of the night, reported as a fire on the scene, smoke in the street. We had the wind at the back of the house. The front door was open. We later found out that the back door was open. The husband escaped by breaking a second floor window, getting out on the porch roof. So we had a building that was being pressurized, a low intake. We had a high exhaust on the second floor. And so that's not atypical. The atypical part of this was that over the previous year, and possibly longer than that, there was a furnace malfunction, and it was burning super hot. And it had dried out the wood surrounding everywhere where the vents had gone. Complicating that a little bit further, the first floor of the house was all 1970s paneling. So this thing was like as ready to burn as it could possibly be. So we get there, smoke showing from coming up over the roof, coming out the second floor window, coming out the front door. One of our truck guys went into the first floor while the line was being deployed. He wanted to do a quick recon, make sure that there was nobody on that first floor, and locate the fire. There was some conflicting information whether it was a basement fire or first floor fire. And he started going back towards the back of the house, and he said he could see fire in different locations, but wasn't really sure where it was coming from. And the floor had dried out so much that it had shrunk. So on any given day, you could look down at the floor and see into the basement. So there was little bits of fire coming through the floor. I think some of it was probably starting to roll over a little bit. He started to go towards the back, got a little disoriented, wasn't really comfortable with where he was at and the volume of heat that he was experiencing. So he decided to come back towards the front of the building. When he got to the front door, there was a little hang up because the crew was starting to come in and they were kind of pushing the door against each other. He gets out, goes out into the street, and about 40 seconds later, the whole first floor lights off. So, I was pretty happy with the decisions that he made. He was able to recognize that this is something atypical is happening right now. It's hot. I can't really locate the fire. And it seems to be a little bit of everywhere, but I can't really find it. So he was like, okay, I'm going to back out, wait for the line, and did that. And then eventually, so that building also had a butler stair in the rear. So between the fire coming through the floor, following all the vents, it also went up into that butler stair. So we very quickly had 3 floors of fire in there. We pulled everybody out of that building, went defensive, which was good because there was some collapsing on the second and third floor later on into the incident. So the building itself was really not in good condition. So we kind of knocked it down with a portable master stream and opened up some of the walls from the exposures and were able to get it knocked down. And it did get it up into the loft, and we had fire in the loft over to one side, exposure on each side. So the trucks got to do a lot of opening up and they trenched it, got that open. So it ended up with a pretty good outcome. But we were certainly on our way to a near miss for sure. But I think the training, in fire behavior and recognizing the conditions around you, paying attention to what's going on around you really paid off. And, he's a high speed dude. So I think was on the ball and was able to recognize that and say, hey, we need to rethink what we're doing here.
It's interesting, we always talk about our guys, those guys that are on the companies that their heads are on a swivel. They're really tuned in to everything that's going on. And part of the challenge goes back to those companies that are not at that level. We may have a company officer that's engaged, but it's a lot more than just one individual that has to really be looking around and pulling all these things together, both at the company, level, and then certainly at the command level. So, Tony, any particular jobs or events that stand out in your mind? I know you made mention of the one in particular here. One of the things that, again, when we take a look at the continuing evolution of our row frames and row houses, again, the aging factor, Brian, that you made mention of earlier on, which is a continuing challenge because as we continue to see the aging effects on these buildings, those that have been maintained and then those that have not been maintained, and we see those increasing in deterioration exponentially. But when we discuss the sizing up of our buildings, I want to ask you this from a twofold standpoint, both at the company level that both of you guys served in and then at the command level. What would you consider to be the most critical size up or evaluation issue, generically speaking, at the company level and then at the command level? So first due company coming in, doing an immediate size up, what would you say, based upon your experiences, typically is going to be the most critical read of that building at the company level and then coming in as the commander as a command officer? What's the most critical thing that for the majority of the events, the outcome may result in something less than desirable?
Fire in the basement.
Tony, I'll ask you first.
Fire in the basement, or the recognition of fire in the basement. I mean,
Yep.
Again, I don't think there's any. If I can go up, right? Again, I can use the reach of my stream if it's a bad fire on the second floor, right? But that basement fire is the worst scenario here. And Washington D.C., our SOGs, our SOPs were built on rowhouse fires. We had competing back in the 70s. It was chaos. It was not. I mean, it was fire trucks got there and they did what they thought was the best thing. So then it kind of fell in a heads up chief, like Chief Bingham said, no, we're gonna control this thing. So they built the SOGs on that, and the biggest part of that, right, was that second due engine that goes to the rear and recognizes the basement fire.
Good insights. Brian, what do you think? What's your thoughts on that?
I would agree with that. I was going to say, where is the fire located? And with the thought that we want to find it at its lowest level first. And then to add to that, I would say the other thing is, what's our ventilation profile? Do we have control of the ventilation? Is it self-vented? Or is the building opened up already? Or is the genie out of the bottle at that point? I think we do absolutely need to know where is the fire originating from first. That's going to drive everything else that we do.
Well, it was an interesting the one of the more recent reports that just got published here this year in the May timeframe. Actually, the date was March, but it wasn't published until May. And this was the double line of duty death that occurred on October 19th, 2023, again in Baltimore City, which predominantly, again, in an 1,800 square foot, two-story row house, had a lot to do with extreme fire behavioral issues that are becoming, I think, more common than uncommon. We talk about the insights out of UL and NIST and all of the issues dealing with fire behavior knowledge and trying to put that all together. And both of you guys have a lot of experience in this particular domain. What would be your recommendation to the companies that are out there, company level officers, when we talk about fire behavior within the row house setting, based on what we know and what we have experienced? So we all have experienced fires in our row houses in a different time and place, and now we are seeing conditions affecting these buildings in my opinion, in a very dramatically different standpoint. So from a command officer's perspective, what would be your recommendations or words of wisdom to the company officers that are out there regarding fire behavior within the row house and row frame occupancy?
I think you need to take the time to understand what's going on. So slow down and take it in. And it is easy, because we run these fires all the time, to deploy on autopilot and say, oh, the fire's on the second floor, the fire's, wherever, and go into that mode. I think we need to slow down and get that good size up and take the time to really understand what it is. Because once we overextend ourselves, it's very hard to come back. And I think that sometimes we get a little ahead of ourselves in having really a full understanding, or as good of an understanding as we possibly can at the time, of what's going on.
I was thinking the same thing. In fact, today, right? I'm at the National Fire Academy, and we're doing safety program class, and we watched the video of Gordon Graham, right? And slow down, and remember that if you take a tactical pause. I did the Back Bay fire in Boston, right? And Chief Schaefer, that was one of the things that he talks about, was a tactical pause to kind of get everything in, and that's from a command level, right? He's talking about command level, but the same thing goes, right? Like Brian said. And the one of the things that he mentioned was the ventilation profile. So that means it's going to take a little bit of time to kind of gather that information about the ventilation profile. It's more than just where the fire is, right? There's other things involved to capture what the ventilation profile is. So that was great. Slow down, tactical pause, right? Take the time to make the time. Absolutely.
So how do you guys, let me ask you this, how would you guys do a check and adjust on a company or company officer that actually we'll say the company that's overly aggressive, potentially has postured themselves into a corner, although the outcome was good. The deployment and the technique that was utilized could have gone a different direction. In other words, slowing down and having these types of pauses is great in concept, but unless they are practiced and unless we do the checks and adjusts, we may not be able to change that human performance behavior. So what would you say? What would you employ to make an adjustment and have that hard conversation with a company or company officer that is overly aggressive and needs to implement what both of you just talked about, that we know is needed? I mean, we talk a lot about this in today's realm of modern tactics, but when it doesn't occur, I normally hear exactly what we always hear, right? We'll check and we'll do a better job next time around. But, I'm surrounded by all of these notes here and all of these lessons and learnings. And unfortunately, the continuing escalation of multiple line of duty deaths, that we're not doing the checks and adjusts. And unfortunately, we could start talking about the aggressiveness posturing that gets the job done. But there's a couple of events here that we're not going to get into, but clearly had a lot to be said about doing just the opposite. So how would you guys have that hard conversations to balance out, Brian, especially with what you just mentioned on the front end of it?
I think that you have to develop the culture on your individual shift or in your department that allows you to have those conversations, that they don't necessarily need to be difficult. So, we pretty aggressively review our fires. I run a lot of cameras on my fires, so we have that video. We look at that video. I think we've kind of developed that culture that, we are going to look at this, not because we want to point out something that somebody did wrong, but we want to be as good as we can and better the next time. So we need to take the incident we just had, use it for the opportunity that it is to learn. Like Chief Carroll said before, I can't recreate a rowhouse fire. So we have to extrapolate everything out that we can when we do have that fire. So we set that up in the beginning, that we are going to have critical conversations. It's not because I don't like you, because I don't think you did a good job, but because we want to be better. And the only way for us to be better is to really take a deep dive on what we just did and make it better for the next time. And I think that, beyond that, I want us to be aggressive. I think that's what our job is. That's what makes us different from, the rest of public works. We clean up messes just like they do, but we also stop messes from getting out of control. But the difference is we are running in there. We are putting ourselves at risk. And I think we have to understand that. And that's what I want. We swore that oath that we're going to be aggressive. We're going to come in. We're going to come for you. We're going to do all of that stuff. But the way to really do that and minimize the risk as much as is possible is to be prepared, understand the building, understand the tactics, train on those tactics, and then execute them as efficiently and effectively as we can, and then review it and work on being better next time. So I think that's the way I like to do it. I'd rather do that and push hard in the beginning than to have to come to you and say, hey, you're not in line with what the expectations are.
Yeah, that's critical. That's very, very critical.
I think one thing, again, from a risk management standpoint, we can have engineering controls, and one thing that we can do is that 360, right? And really emphasize the importance of the 360. Fairfax just implemented a special service 360. So not only are the first arriving engine required or does one, but the first arriving special piece will do one as well. And I think that goes back to the emphasis about, building intelligence, fireground intelligence. What is the special service looking for? Obviously, they're looking for searchable spaces, probably ventilation profile, right? So all those things can help you, and right, that's kind of that tactical pause built into that first initial stage to gather that information. And we've heard those things, right? Where the 360 helped me to get more information, or we've heard bad stories about when the 360 wasn't done, and then the consequences with that. So, if there's no person hanging out the front window, we know that we have time to do that 360 and gather that information. So maybe that's one thing to instill to help to get that little bit of time built in the beginning that will help us in the end, right?
And again, we talk about the 360 for our audience and listeners, there is that typical formality, just to sort of put it back in perspective, because of the footprint within our typical domains and our areas of our row frames and row houses, with the numbers of units that may be spanning a particular block area. There may be some challenges in getting to the rear of that structure, into the alleyway and so forth. But again, we don't talk enough about it. Just get into the exposures at whatever point, get from front to rear. Just get those eyes on the rear of the structure to determine what factors may be presenting themselves, what conditions may be attributed that are going to help command in the decision-making process. But however you do it, whether you get onto the roof, take a look over, or go from front, the Alpha side, back to the Charlie side in the available exposures, or do that 360 around the end units and so forth. There's a lot of ways to get that across. And again, as Tony, as you were mentioning, I was just going back through a couple of statistics and some other items here from our conversations about lessons and learnings. Again, the 360 constantly keeps coming up, especially in the LODD reports, as either being a deficiency or a challenging condition, or in some instances, an omission that was a contributor. Maybe not so much direct. A couple of them were direct contributors toward the common causes that led to those undesirable events. So
can I hit on that?
These are all part and parcel of it.
Can I hit on that some more? So again, I mean, I know, in my job in DC, we had the first engine went to the front, first engine, first truck, second engine, second truck goes to the rear. And the idea, right, is to get that 360, maybe not one unit. I think the problem, though, the breakdown is are we listening for that information? Yeah. Are we doing that? One. Two, are we so overwhelmed with stuff going on that am I picking in and digesting that information, right? The whole stress of the fire ground and the friction of war, right?
Brian, what do you think? We're talking about the 360, and you have some exceptional video clips that get into the tactical windows of that first 10 minutes of operations, and you certainly have been challenged by not having the ability to get around to the 360. And again, when you listen to those video clips, communicating and getting information back to the companies on scene and so forth, to do what? Really to get someone else to put their eyes on it, get a couple of exposures down. So how do you deal with the challenges of that 360, both personally and then also the delegation of that to the other companies?
I believe that, it's important. The 360 is a critical function. I don't think we can argue that at this point, but I think that you have to be intentional about getting it done, because it is easy to be diverted into a million other things. And, I come from a department that doesn't have the luxury of a lot of command personnel arriving, simultaneously or even very quickly. A lot of times I'm by myself. And, I have a bunch of acting lieutenants on my shift. And so these are guys that are firemen that are acting, as lieutenants. They're on their promotions list. And recently I had a fire and I was headed around the back, and one of those acting lieutenants was already coming back from having been back there. And he was like, "Hey, I got a 360 done. This is what's going on." I still went back there and did my 360 as well, but I was really proud of him. And I was like, okay, it's working. Like, we're getting this message across that this is a critical part of the operation. So I think you have to be intentional about it, get back there. And if you can't complete the 360, you have to call on some other resources, right? Your truck company's going to the roof. A lot of people complain about people that talk fires out, and I understand that. But at the same time, I think if you do the training and you become intentional with what conversations that you need to have, and you think those things through, you can get that kind of information. So if I do a 360, I'm going to go back like everybody else, and I'm going to report my findings on the 360. And if I can't complete the 360, that's going to be part of the message is like, hey, I didn't get this done. And then I can get that maybe from the roof or from somebody at a different location. Just because I can't get there from that position, that doesn't mean, okay, well, we don't get to do that today. No, we still have to do it. So I think that's really important.
I think that clearly is a message back to the companies that are listening out there, both figuratively and so forth. But you've got to be listening to what's going on and have enough initiative to pick up on what is not being done and initiate that action. So again, to our companies, even if you're on at the task level, you and your partner, and you're listening to command not being able to complete an item, take that initiative. And again, it's going to be a testing condition. Pick up on it, communicate, get some information. But I think, Brian, the other critical part of this thing that commanding officers have to instill is you've got to validate the communications. And again, it depends a lot on your level of trust in who's communicating what information. But again, we sometimes blindly trust too much in those communications without validating. And unfortunately, I see that firsthand too, that information may not be quite accurate or something gets lost in the translation. So commanding officers, because we do not have that latitude to mess up on the fireground, when things start going bad, they are going to go seriously bad because of a series of cascading events in a very compressed time frame. We don't have we don't have the ability to recover a lot in our row house and row frames due to characteristically the building characteristics. So one of those tidbits of insights to commanding officers, when you have the ability or when, again, there's a shadow of doubt, validate some of the information that's coming out there. So I'm glad Chief Carroll was able to come back here. We'll talk back to Emmetsburg with their continuing challenges of technical issues, but I'm glad you're back. So we were just closing out. So you sort of were in your conversation. I don't know if you remember where you lost that connection, but if you want to continue on your conversation that you started giving us there, Tony.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've recognized in several of the recent incidents, right, is that overloading the thinking, the mind, the ability to kind of think and react, right? So is that the tactical pause will help with that, I hope. And maybe one thing to kind of gather all your thoughts and get your stuff together before you go across the threshold.
We talk a lot about specialty units and resources and its availability. Brian, you made mention of the fact that you don't have a lot of resources to be able to set up extensive command organizations and have a lot of depth in additional individuals to help support actions. And again, both of you come from organizations that have some depth in terms of those things. But many of our listeners are also operating with some challenges, not only in terms of staffing levels on first due response companies, but obviously from an operational perspective where, again, we're not getting what we normally are hearing in the academies and in the training environments about what we would like to have in terms of an optimum fireground capacity in terms of resources and personnel and checking all these boxes and so forth. So what would both of you say were for our departments that are listening in, where there is limited staffing and limited resources, what would be a recommendation or some of your learnings on how to overcome some of those resource staffings in these time critical, let's say that 10-minute tactical or 15-minute tactical window where a lot of things have to be done. I've got limited personnel to do it. you're the commanding officer or you're the first due coming in as a company officer. What's your perspective on trying to overcome those or prioritize? Let's say prioritize incident issues at an event that demands multiple things to be happening all at the same time. We can't sometimes delegate. We can't prioritize and leave something off. What's your take from your experiences of prioritizing the fire ground for those that are in command positions during some very hectic initial stages of that 10 to 15 minute window with limited resources?
So I think that number one, starting before the incident, task level skill sets have to be on point. So we cannot be part of the problem. We don't have the resources to recover when we get behind the eight ball because of things that we've done wrong or not efficiently enough. That creates a more challenging situation for us. So companies have to be good at their jobs. They have to be able to deploy. For us, the official answer to this, nobody is going to say, you start to break your crews up into smaller groups. Like, nobody wants to do that. But there are times in our situation, because it is what it is, we have to operate independently or with a smaller group than we need to. So because of that, we have to train for that eventuality as well. So you have to be able to do those things so that we can get multiple jobs done. On scene, understanding that incident, understanding the building construction, knowing where the fire is, where it's been, where it's going, communicating that. And then we work pretty hard on benchmark communications. And I think that that's important so that people know what jobs are getting done, who is where, what they're doing, and what needs to be completed yet, what's outstanding. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we have in the fire service in any situation is like task saturation and fixation. And we need to slow down, listen to what everybody else is doing. And that's why I think the communications is important, where we don't want to talk the fire to death, but we want to say the things that we need to say. And it's not just me that needs to hear that. Everybody needs to hear those things. So while you're forcing the door or cutting the roof or whatever it is that you're doing, you do need to pay attention to the rest of the situation. And that helps streamline everybody's job because we have to be efficient and effective in everything we do, because that next wave of personnel could be delayed or not coming or, whatever. We just don't have endless resources. So it has to, we put a lot of emphasis on getting it done correctly the first time. And I think that's pretty important.
Yeah. Great insight.
I'd say that. I mean, we're set up for this fire, right? Our attack lines are set up for this. I mean, you're thinking about a typical row house. What is that? 20 by 35, 20 by 30. That's 600 square feet per floor. Divide that by 3. We're talking 200 gallons a minute, right? Or 200 gallons. And your attack lines are typically flowing 160 to 170. So we're set up for that. So, like you said, be good at that. If we put the fire out, I don't want to make it so simple, but if we put the fire out, a lot of the problems go away. They definitely, and it may not make them all go away, but it kind of slows everything down for us, right? Giving us time to be able to get to those other problems. Now, if I have a citizen saying my kid's in there, well, then I'm going to focus on that, right? And we're going to throw everything we can at that. So we don't have to do multiple things necessarily, right? Again, I have to, if I get there with no indication that there's somebody inside, let's focus on the fire. If I get there and somebody's saying there's somebody in there, well, let's focus on where that would be. And can we search that with what we have on scene? So I think, again, right, just like the big elephant, how do you eat one bite at a time? Same thing here. We're going to do what we can do, right? Because conditions drive our tactics. And we're kind of, like I said, we're kind of set up to be able to do this fire. We have the tools necessary to really combat if it's a one room of fire or a floor of fire. And even if it's 2 floors, we start here and put that one, then go to that one, right? So I think we have an advantage, right? We've kind of, because of our histories in these places, we set ourselves up for success. And then I would tell an officer to focus on what you can focus on and what you need to focus on. Again, without any kind of report, find out where the fire is. If there's nobody trapped, focus on the fire. If there's somebody trapped, then maybe focus on that.
Great insights. Absolutely great insights. We've been talking about some of the more common types of work and jobs that one would involve in, and we really haven't gotten into any discussions, although it's quite likely and very common to see events escalate in terms of greater alarms or escalate from a room and contents or a condition that is much more easily achievable to something that's significantly challenging, escalate in terms of a row house to multiple units. Let me ask you this: what's your decision-making points, or what criteria are you utilizing to determine, let's say, criteria to go from offensive to defensive? What are some of the parameters based upon your experiences that you're looking for to get to that tipping point and benchmark of, hey, I really need to get these guys out of that interior or get into a different postured position of a more defensive mode? Tony, what's your thoughts on that?
Again, right, multiple floors of fire. If it's starting to come out of that one compartment and taking on the Alpha Bravo exposures, again, those are some of the decisions. I think, again, I mean, the guys know their neighborhoods, and they probably know the ones that are in really bad shapes, really bad conditions. And hopefully they're communicating that back. And again, like Brian was saying, we're going to have these discussions ahead of time and say, look, guys, don't put yourself in those positions. So, finding those officers, instilling that in them so they can tell me that they can't go in there, they can't make it, and then backing them up, supporting their decisions. But fire, building conditions, those kinds of things are going to help with my decision.
Yep, I agree with that. And I think that, I hate to just say this because it's kind of a cop-out answer, but sometimes it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't look right. And you say, okay, something's not right here. You have to trust that. That's your subconscious doing work that you can't, always comprehend. And you see that and it doesn't feel right. If I start to get that feeling, then we're gonna pull out. Also, understanding your personnel and their personalities and how they operate at fires and listening to them. What's their stress level? How hard are they working? Is this fire beyond us already? Are we playing catch up? Obviously every fire is beyond us because we're not there when it starts. But when we get there, is this fire extending rapidly? Is it in the void spaces? Is it in multiple buildings? Is it out back? Is it in the air shaft out back? That creates a very significant amount of energy to the fire. And I think you start to do that size up and you look at those fires and you can tell, is this a lazy fire? Is it burning just because it's burning? Or is this fire out to get somebody? Is it aggressive? Does it have everything that it needs? It has the heat, it has the air. And, these buildings kind of capitalize on that air track, right? Like we know that the design of this building helps, exacerbate that quick fire growth. So when we see those things happening, if we're not in the position with the appropriate weaponry, then we have to make a decision to back out and then regain that ground. So maybe we back out, hit it from the outside real hard, and then go back in, Or, maybe we say, you know what, it's just not worth it. We're going to stay. We're coming out and we're staying out.
Yeah.
Or maybe we lead off that way as well. Start with a bigger weapon. I like to tell my guys all the time, the way that we are going to size this up is not from the bottom up, but from the top down, right? We shouldn't be asking, is this an 1 3/4 fire, or assuming that it is. We should be saying, is this a deck gun fire? Yes, no. Is this a 2.5 fire? Yes, no. I'm not a big 2.5 in a row house fan because I think it slows your progress down. But, so that, let's ask that question first. Start with the big guns. Do we need them? No, we can get this. Okay, then we start with the smaller lines. But we have to be open to that. And then, once that decision is made, the decision is made, and that's what we're going to do. And then we will take that tactical pause and reevaluate and either stick with the withdrawal or we'll regroup and go back at it a different way.
Great insights. And those are consistent, I believe, with the modern philosophies and viewpoints. And I think one of the really major takeaways, again, going from top down, larger to smaller, and that has shown and proven itself to be very effective. It's contrary to conventional wisdom in some thought processes. Again, when we go back to old school methodologies and practices, but I think in today's realm, today's buildings, conditions, our fire loading, our staffing levels, they are consistent with the themes that the current generation within the fire service needs to internalize and understand and comprehend. It's not always defaulting without thought and process and critical thinking. So some really good insights. We're starting to wind down in our segment here. I'm going to ask you guys a pretty pointed question because, again, it's one of the challenges with these particular building types when we talk about whether we utilize the occupancy term of vacant or what I try to default back to, more importantly, that gives it a more specific characteristic, but an abandoned, derelict building. Those buildings that truly have very apparent, identifiable, and significant conditions that highly suggests there's some bad things going on in this building, which may or may not result in some degree of occupancy until we do the search. But there's quite a bit of conversation out there on the job about vacants, which, again, guys, when we talk about vacant, it's nothing more than an occupancy status. It has nothing to do with risk. But when we start talking about this in terms of a derelict or abandoned structure, that should give us some connotations about the correlation to risk. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you. When we talk about abandoned, derelict / vacant buildings, which you've got a lot of experience with, what's your perspective to today's commanding officer when we talk about row houses and row frames and these types of challenging conditions?
So it's a tough thing. I wish that this is a problem we can't solve here tonight, but I wish that the American Fire Service had some common language because, you can go from our town to a town 30 miles away and we can call the same thing different things. And that makes it tough. But I think that when we look at these buildings, we have a ton of buildings in that category, but we also have a ton of people living in those buildings, or at least occupying them for parts of the day, as drug houses or whatever situation. We have them in every level of occupancy. I had a lady complaining to me about people squatting in the building that she was living in, that she was squatting in. And she was like, these squatters are really making this a mess. And I was like, okay, I feel like you're doing the same thing, but that's for another day. But so, we're running into these buildings with people in them all of the time. That being said, so we have an obligation to search them as best as we can, but I have an obligation to send you home at the end of your shift as well, if I can do that. And I know that may not always be in my control, but that's my goal. I want to send everybody home safely, but I also want to save every citizen that we possibly can, regardless of their social economic status. So I think we have a obligation to do all of that. And it's tough. It's a tough needle to thread because we're going to have to make some tough decisions. We may have to take on a level of risk that we're not super comfortable with on occasion. But at the same time, we also have to live up to what we tell people we're going to do, which is we're going to come and get you. Understanding that building construction, being good at your job, having good fireground communications, and knowing what our limitations are, I think is really important. And when we look at these buildings that are in terrible shape, I think we have to decide and talk about before this situation develops, what is an effective search of that kind of building? How far are we going to go? Okay, we're going to throw a ladder to here. We're going to look in these windows. We'll use the technology to our advantage if we can, and do the best we can. We try to mark buildings with a single slash or an X, so that we know the conditions that are in there, but they're constantly evolving. So that's just a guide as well. But we have to keep our eyes on the ball and get out there and see these buildings and understand their evolution and how they're being used, what's going on, listen to the people in the community when they tell us there's people in there, or, that kind of stuff. And it's a tough decision, and I'm not trying to get out of this question, but I think it's a game day decision on how far are we going to go based on the conditions that are present. But we have to have a plan, and we have to have a no-go line where we say, okay, that's it. No, we are not going to do this. So I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. And actually, before Chief Carroll gets into it, I just want to say this. Is it safe to say that you are, and again, our listeners have to make this connection, you are still conducting a risk assessment at all stages in that decision-making process. And
Absolutely.
That, I think, is critical for our listeners to, again, internalize that we are not abandoning any particular aspect, that even though we have these conditions that are significantly challenging now, and I always say this, those are the decisions that you're going to make at that given period of time in the streets based on all of those parameters that are being assessed, that are either apparent, that are known, and so forth. But at the end of the day, you still have to employ some degree of risk assessment in that process at the command and at the tactical level to help determine what and validate what your actions are going to be. So I just wanted to pull that together, and you said it, I think, very appropriately. So I thank you for that. Chief Carroll, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we struggled with this in DC for years, and there was one battalion chief who kind of took it upon himself to establish a vacant building tracking. And as units would drive through and they would see something, they were to go over and write that down, and then we could do a further investigation. And then there would be like Chief Bassanelli said, you would have an X or a one slash, and then you could have like an R if the roof was open, or an F if the floor was in bad shape. But that was kind of a grassroots kind of thing, right? And then that kind of died off. But within the last, probably 6 years, there's been a vacant building policy where it's been recognized that these buildings should be treated differently. And again, it's a derelict building, or it's one that's got boards on it, right? One that you can obviously see that it's different than the one that's next to it that's occupied. So with that, when you announce that, things slow down, and a more in-depth, if you will, assessment of that building occurs, right? And I think it was good because they put a couple of unit officers together to do a good size up. If needed, one of the things that's done too is before you go in, all the man traps come off. right? So again, we're not hindering an escape if we had to. Everything comes off. Now, one of the problems with that, of course, is that's going to allow air and stuff, right? So there's again, right, a risk-benefit analysis on that. What do we do? So, but after all those things are done, then the assessment continues, and we decide, are we going to go into this thing? So, I mean, again, I think that we've moved to, there's a conscious, decision, not the automatic thing like we would in the occupied one that's next door, that's in, better shape. So, I mean, I think that we're doing this. We're doing a good job, or a better job, I guess, right? And again, and with that, right, because there's a policy now, we can train people on that, and we can have officers. We can do a simulation with a vacant building or a derelict building, if you will, so that we're practicing these things. So, I mean, I think we're. Are we perfect? Are we there? Are we totally good? No, but it's been recognized, and I mean, finally, right? And we know that there's some dangers. I really like, again, if you get out and talk to your people, set some expectations. That'll help us get on board, get in front of this thing, so we're not caught off guard. We didn't do building inspections like, go out and check for clearance of sprinkler heads and things like that. But we definitely, get out in your neighborhoods and pay attention. You put the phones down while you're riding around, and the guys in the back, if the guys in the front missed it, the guys in the back should be saying, hey, there's a vacant building over there. Let's go look at it, right? So I think that we just have to turn our radar on, our eyes and ears, to help get out and get ahead of this thing.
I think a common theme to all of our conversations here on this episode have been engagement at all levels, at the individual, at the company, at the box level of the resources that are available. Everybody's got to be engaged. Everybody, the pre-incident preparation, as well as the continuous evaluation of many contributors and factors on a very dynamic fire ground. Although simple, very dynamic in terms of what the outcome may be. And again, it could change certainly in an instant. So I'm just looking at a couple of other notes here. We've covered some tremendous ground here in a very, very short time frame. I really appreciate the insights that both of you have provided to our listeners. I think for those of you listening in, if you haven't paid attention, there are numerous nuggets of wisdom and insights at all levels, whether you are just getting into the job or whether you've got a lot of years on as a company officer or at the command level. Some insights here on an easy until they're not building fire. Brian, again, I want to thank you for that little nugget there. So we're going to wrap up our part 4 episode here, talking about tactical perspectives, street view conversations. Again, I want to thank Battalion Chief Brian Bastinelli out of Harrisburg, and again, Chief Tony Carroll for both of you taking the time out of your busy schedules and really providing our listeners with really some things that are trying to pull a lot of things together in a very challenging but very common building and occupancy type that there are no easy answers to. I mean, we are continuing to impress upon the fact that there's a lot of things that are pretty consistent with showing up, stretching the line, and going in, and at the same time, the profound need for critical thinking, conservative bias, effective decision making, having tactical pauses, understanding benchmarking, just understanding what needs to be done in a very timely fashion that requires everyone to be at the top of their game before they hit the street and before they get into these buildings. So, guys, thank you very, very much for taking time out and contributing to this episode of Buildings on Fire's podcast series on row houses. Any closing comments, Brian? First to you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I think you hit it spot on. Get out, engage with these buildings, understand them, and the community that lives in them and around them, and put the work in ahead of time, and it won't be as hard when the fire comes in.
Absolutely. Chief Carroll, closing comments?
Yeah, Brian kind of touched on it earlier, but you're only as good as your next fire. Again, we have walls full of pictures of fires from years ago, and I want your next picture, right, to be your next fire picture to be a success, and everybody, everything, you knocked everything out of the park. Well, in order to do that, you're going to have to put some effort into that and preparation, right? So again, you're only as good as your next fire. You don't know what it's going to be, so you need to practice on everything and think about everything.
Absolutely. One other closing comment: if your gut's telling you something ain't right, guys, chances are it ain't right. I think that is one of the most consistent themes for those of us that have been there. When we talk about that gut level human performance issues, that is experience talking to us. And if it doesn't quite feel right, look right, take appropriate actions, whatever they may be. So thanks, guys. And again, for our listeners here, this closes out our first segment on the tactical perspectives. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be joining in on our second alarm segment, which will deal specifically with some command street perspectives as we reboot. So thanks very much, and tune in for our second part series. Alrighty, welcome back to our second alarm portion of our Part 4 series on Rowhouse. Our focus on our Module 4 has been talking about the fire ground, looking at operations. Our front-end portion, our first alarm segment, focused in on looking at the tactical side of fireground operations. And here, as we return back to our program, we're going to be talking about the second part of our series, focusing in on command street perspectives. Joining us on this panel, again, is two exceptional commanding officers, Deputy Chief Lee Shapiro from Hartford, Connecticut Fire Department, retired, and Deputy Chief Vince Mulray, retired from the City of Philadelphia Fire Department in Pennsylvania. And Vince, again, I certainly want to welcome you back. We had an opportunity, again, we actually convened, if some of you are aware, back in 2020, going back 5 years now, we convened a very explicit and very concentrated multiple-part program talking about row houses, and that coming on the heels of a couple of events that occurred back in that time frame. One specific, when we talked about the lieutenant, or at that time, Captain Matt Letourneau's line-of-duty death, dealing with the North Colorado Street fire that occurred in January of 2018. A lot of insights were developed, both from the Philadelphia Fire Department, subsequently with NIOSH getting involved, and myself having the profound privilege to work both with the Philadelphia Fire Department as well as with NIOSH and with Chief Mulray on both the internal and external programs that led us into the conversations talking about row houses, challenges, and here we are again revisiting this, specifically based upon a couple of events that occurred both in 2024, as well as a very prominent event and tragic event that occurred in Baltimore City in 2023. Both events occurring in the city of Baltimore. The 2023 event led to a triple line-of-duty death in an abandoned row house structure, abandoned, derelict, vacant. We sort of utilize those three terms collectively. And then the second that occurred in another row house in 2024 that resulted in a double line-of-duty death. So again, we are seeing some trending issues that are out there. The whole focal point of our series here on the podcast has been to provide some insights, challenges, construction, operations, lessons and learnings, the predictability of these building types. We talked about construction in our Part 3 episode, and here we are focusing in on the street level perspectives that are critical, both at the company, at the initial command level for our battalion chiefs, our district chiefs, and then certainly as the incidents continue to evolve at the deputy chief's level based upon transferring a command or the complexities of those events. So our conversation here on our second alarm episode is going to focus in on not only the single unit fire conditions in those row house and row frames, but also hopefully our conversation is going to evolve a little bit in those all hands, multiple alarm, those challenging situations that go beyond the single unit footprint of that row house and row frame. So again, for our panelists, Chief Shapiro, Chief Mulroy, again, thank you very, very much for taking time out of your schedules to provide some insights to not only our North American fire service, but certainly our international listeners that may be trying to gain some insights on a very common building type that's located throughout the United States, but very predominant. We talk about the Northeast, talk about the Boston, we talk about New York City, tri-state area of Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, the Philadelphia row house, the Baltimore row house, the DC row house. And then as we evolve further and we go into the Chicago types of row house and brownstones, Denver, St. Louis, and so forth, all the way to the West Coast. So let me start off by asking an open-ended question, and whoever wants to jump in first here. What would you consider to be some of the unique challenges that both the row house and row frame provide on today's fire ground? Based upon, again, some things that used to be pretty common back in the day, 15, 20, 30 years ago, but some of the unique conditions that are now confronting today's commanding officers, in particular in the streets from an operational perspective.
Who goes first?
Chief Shapiro, you're going to lead off, so go ahead, brother.
Who, me?
Yes.
Go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, they don't really build them like that anymore, so whatever is still out there is pretty old. Depending on if it was maintained or not maintained, it's in good shape, or maybe not. The building might not be able to withstand any type of insult, never mind a raging fire. You have all kinds of access issues. You might have a common basement, common attic. You might not have any access to the rear side of the building. You might not have enough water on the street. I mean, it's just a whole list of problems. And did I mention it's like one giant building as opposed to a bunch of little buildings? So fire spread could be a problem depending on what's going on. You throw 20, 25, 30 guys in a building and you're overloading it as it is just with the fire personnel. And then whatever is eating away at that structure to fire or maybe rot. And this is a recipe for disaster.
Chief Mulroy, you want to add to that?
The only thing I could add is just piggybacking on what Lee was saying is about the age of the buildings. I mean, the housing stock in Philadelphia and on most East Coast cities, look at Colorado Street. It was 130 years old. I don't know if we designed and built these buildings in the late 1800s to last 130 years. And when you talk about, whether they were maintained or not maintained, that's another aspect that comes into play. Another thing that we found over the years when we talk about renovations, every time a building changes hands, there's some kind of renovation done. And renovations historically are not good for the fire service. It's always something that weakens the building. Lee mentioned a little bit about population density. When we look at, the way the population in the 1850s, 1860s, every decade, the population in Philadelphia was increasing, and they were just trying to build houses to meet that demand. Some of the row houses in Philadelphia, or some of the streets, have 60 houses on them. And when we look at Colorado Street, that was a prime example. This is a 130-year-old house. It was in poor condition. Of course, we didn't know that, and then the people who responded there didn't know that. But as you were aware, I did the after-action review for that fire, and we found out things in the months that followed that the incident commander and the responding crews would have never known, because you just don't get that in the size up. You know what I mean? There's a lot of little clues, but Chris, and you're aware that we analyzed the wood on that, and we found out that it was hemlock, and we found out that's an inferior wood that was built, that house was built of. We found out that the mortar did not have Portland cement. It was just sandstone and lime. That did not contribute to the collapse, but it's like one more penny on a scale, so to speak, that tips the weight against the responding firefighters. And we know that was a catastrophic collapse basically by the amount of people and the amount of water we put in that building. And I know you put us, back on our heels to try to quantify the amount of water, but we couldn't do it. We know we've dumped a ton of water in there from the front because we have stills and we have video from it, but we really had very little information from the rear. And most of the information we had came from an emerging technology, which was police body cam. Without that, 10 years ago, we wouldn't even have that. It goes on and on.
And actually, we 10 years ago, we wouldn't even be having these conversations because the job really did not demand anything more than showing up at these fires, doing the work, and hopefully going home. And when things did go bad, and again, there's so many undocumented events over the 30, 40, 50 years, and especially even going back further, that were consistent with what we just talked about, right? Continuing aging structures that have a variety of factors that in some instances are identifiable and many others are not, and are not being identified due to a variety of factors, whether it be training, knowledge, experience, or complacency, or being too busy, focusing in on the tactical side, not looking at the big picture. But I think both of you just really reiterated some common themes about the continuing aging housing stock and the fact that as each year or decade continues to move onward, you can expect internal environmental factors to affect the building just aging, as well as what you just mentioned, Vince, the changes in the building's usage as different owners in combination with the aging of the structure to change that building. And certainly these buildings are not what they were back at the time in which they were built. Before I add on one other note here, I want to make mention of, we mentioned the Baltimore, the city of Baltimore fire there on Strichter Street. What was very unique and unfortunately never made it into the published NIOSH report that just came out here in May of 2025, a very consolidated and shorter version report than what many of us were expecting to have published for a variety of reasons. But I'll just make a mention of this. When we typically think of a bearing wall within our Type 3 row house occupancies, one normally expects to find how thick of a wall. And I'll pose this as a question first, and then I'm going to give you the surprising factor of what we ended up encountering. So when we talk about a bearing wall, whether it be a party wall or a bearing wall in a Type 3 row house structure, what do we expect to be the width at a minimum?
Double brick, double width.
Couple of brick, right? So a couple of widths of bricks typically are around 8 or so inches. So in the Strichter Street fire, just one width of brick, 4 inches. That was a party wall supporting both of the 2x8 floor joists on either side of it that was pocketed in with continuing openings on either side of it. So again, up until that incident, there's never been a conversation anywhere that we've seen documented. Even the guys on the job in Baltimore never would have expected that these series of row houses, the individuals that comprise that city block, would be constructed with just a 4-inch width, single width brick wall. So again, it's a game changer, right? It changes the operability of the building. It changes the building's ability to withstand thermal assault, withstand all of the other factors of personnel going in the building, the fire conditions, and everything else, as Chief Shapiro just mentioned. Did you have another comment, Chief?
Yeah, actually, when I came on the job in '88, we used to go to these buildings that are on fire, old buildings, built in the 1920s, and I used to say, "Oh, that's nice, it's quaint, it's cute." Now, the 100th year birthday of these buildings was 5 years ago. These buildings are over 100 years old now, if not more. So now that changes everything completely, because not only is the construction different, but it's so old and possibly modified and whatever that, when you go into these things, you kind of have to expect something bad might happen, because it's a really old building. It's been around for a long time. Whoever's been tinkering with it, construction, reconstruction, renovation, You don't know. You really, you have to get in there and do a pre-plan to see this for up close, to see what's been done, and make it your business to get in there and look around and make notes and maybe draw up a report and send it out department wide saying, hey, this is what we have in this building, and these buildings are very similar. You can't take anything for granted now.
When we talk about the assessment of the building, I'll ask you guys this. Coming in as the, whether it be a battalion chief or certainly in the positions of the deputy chief, what is it that you're looking to validate or further assess based upon the arrival sequence? So you're arriving on scene. What are some of the aspects of that building that you're looking to identify in that command size up that may have already been done to, again, either validate the assumptions that are being made or identify some things that may not have been picked up by the previous arriving commanding officer, whether it be at the company or the BC level? Is there something more that you're looking at? What is your experience? How is that driven by a different viewpoint of observation skills on the building?
Chris, could I back up for a second and
Sure. Yep.
Just go back to the previous topic? We talked about Baltimore with the single width of masonry support between the houses. In Philadelphia, we talked about, and we didn't talk about it yet, but each floor joist was notched. And when you think about those characteristics of each row house in different cities and different parts of the eastern United States, the one thing in common is that the initial arriving crews and the initial incident commander would not have that information. We didn't know about the notch in Philadelphia until Colorado Street. I went and surveyed plenty of my peers who spent 30 years in those neighborhoods. Some were retired, some were active, and I asked every one of them about the notch. Nobody saw that notch before. And basically it was a 1-inch notch laid down on top of the joist, and it was for the gas lighting. It was for the gas pipe that supplied the lighting for these properties. Now, that information just wasn't available until this particular time. Now, fast forward to today, we're finding that notch all over the city, sometimes in West Philly, sometimes in North Philly. But it's almost, it's not funny to see, but it's like how come we never saw that before? Yeah. And I'm sure that in Baltimore, the first arriving men and women there and the first arriving initial incident commander had no idea that it was a single wyeth of brick holding that joist up. We don't know these things until we have an after-action review. We do an in-depth investigation of the building. We call out a building engineer to dissect the building and to help the fire marshal and the health and safety officer and all the people who contribute to the reports that document this event. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I know it's off topic of your question.
No, it isn't. We talked about some aspects of identity. When we size up our structures, there are some things that have become very obvious because we've been conditioned and trained through our readings and through things that we observe and develop that skill set on the fire ground. But the challenge is always this: how do I know if I'm looking at something and I don't comprehend what it is that I'm looking at, you never make that connection. And that is part of it. And I think the conversations that we're having, not only in this series, but any of the conversations within the training ground, the fire ground, the academies, the podcasting and so forth, we are trying to instill on our audiences who may not have seen certain things, the ability to say, have a more questioning attitude. If something doesn't quite look right, ask somebody who may have some other insights. Hopefully before an after action report is required, before an LODD occurs. But something as simple as these notched floor joists that were introduced in a particular time frame based upon technology in the life cycle of these buildings, it wasn't until a precipitating event which resulted in a line of duty death. And again, these guys, how many overhauls of these structures do you think have occurred since, let's say, the early 1900s until 2018 in the city of Baltimore, or the city of Philadelphia. Tens upon tens upon tens of thousands. And this notch has been there. We've opened up floors, we've opened up ceilings, but nobody comprehended what they were because nobody talked about it. So, these are the challenges. And Chief Shapiro, you talk about this aging condition, and that I think is one of the most predominant things that we've got to develop some additional skill sets on, is how to start looking at the things that are quite obvious. We've got an old building. Well, what is very unique about this old structure here in 2025 at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon that's going to set this incident apart from the previous job that we had last shift, last week, last month, or last year? And that becomes the distinction. We are just not understanding the construction, understanding some of the things that are unique and not picking up on them because, and again, I'm going to go a little off script here. We just don't have the building knowledge. We just don't understand construction and features and things that are occurring over these decades of time that sometimes lead to dramatic changes that are right in front of us until something bad ends up happening.
Yeah. So for me, I would generally get there kind of last. The assignment would already be at work, kind of laying out the process. And I'm just off the top of my head, I'm looking at three things immediately. How long's this thing been cooking? How much water are we dumping in it by the time I got there? And I need to take a really careful look at this building and see what condition it's in. Because the more things I see that are not right, that look dilapidated or cracking or falling apart, or it just looks run down. The more I see, the more I'm leaning towards getting everybody out of there. Just get them out of there. Dump the building, civilians, and just go defensive if you have to, because the building literally is trying to kill us. I mean, that's its job, basically. It's trying to kill us. And I'm going to do everything I can to stop that. And if
that's
I have
great.
to,
I mean, again, coming in at that stage of the game, and again, I think our audience needs to understand, although we may be going in a particular direction operationally, and especially as commanding officers arrive on scene, taking in that big picture and making some important decisions that need to be made to either stay the course or to alter that. Chief Mulroy, how easy is it to make adjustments, especially when we talk about the row frames or the row houses, because of their compact size, due to the limitations? I mean, these are not large mega mansions. They're not commercial structures. We have very consolidated compartments, a pretty simple type of footprint in terms of access to basements or upper floors and so forth. How easy is it to change directions from your experience?
Chris, I just want to piggyback on what Lee mentioned about time. And I think time is one of the biggest factors in these row houses, and they affect every rank differently. So the initial lieutenant or captain gets there within a couple of minutes. Their time frame is a lot different than the second responding incident commander, who might be a battalion chief. He might be in the 5 or 6 minute range. As a deputy chief, the majority of the time, my response time would be 20 plus minutes. So, and I think it's a lot easier for, say, a higher ranking officer, whether you're a chief or a deputy chief, to take your clipboard and put an X across the building because of maybe fire involvement, how long the crews have been working, the condition of the building, what you see, what you hear. You've been listening to the radio as you're responding. The adjustments, as long as we have good command and control, it's easier to make the adjustments because we practice the incident command system on every run. We have key people in critical roles. We have battalion chiefs in the front and rear. We know where our people are. Everybody has a radio. So the adjustment from, say, offensive to defensive, depending on the size of the building, which are all relatively small, it could occur relatively quickly. And then we also have emergency evacuation signals with the air horns and the radios and stuff like that. So I think with technology, we're a lot further on than we were, say, when I first came on the fire service, like you guys. But I have to really reiterate about time. I think time is one of the biggest factors. I know when I was a battalion chief and I was working in the lower North Philadelphia section, when we had the fire knockdown, room and contents, maybe the primary and secondary were already complete, I would always check the time from the time of dispatch to the time the fire was under control as a benchmark. And I remember 19 minutes coming up more times than not. And that was just my personal experience. And I like to use that, not that it's written in stone or anything like that, but it was just a benchmark in my mind that 19, 20 minutes, and from Emanuel Fried, the 20-minute rule, and you apply the 20-minute rule to Colorado Street, it was almost like in 1955, he was writing it for the Philadelphia Fire Department. Because all the characteristics that he mentioned, the amount of water you put it in, the absorption rate, the condition of the building, we checked all those boxes. And yet at 43 minutes after dispatch, our single family row house that was 1,034 square feet collapsed, and we lost the life of Matt Letourneau.
Yeah. It's interesting, when we talk about these tactical windows and the 20-minute rule in the fire ground, originally, again, that 20-minute rule was born in the late 1940s. The NFPA handbook in 1948 started talking about 20 minutes of operational time, primarily from a building structural integrity standpoint. Emanuel Fried in the Fireground Tactics book, or the Red Book, really, I think, solidified that concept due to predictability of these buildings. So as Chief Shapiro has been talking about, this continuing aging factor have dramatically changed somewhat of our tactical windows. So although most buildings, again, based upon the thermal assault, firefighting conditions, application of water, the live loads, the dead loads, all of these things that we are putting into the buildings, we're still expecting these buildings to give us that 20 plus minutes of operational time that's always been anecdotally consistent with the fire ground. But now, unfortunately, we're seeing some very adverse conditions occurring in a very compressed standpoint. What I've seen from our research, and even some of the NIOSH reports that are coming out, and the 6 to 10 minutes, the 6 to 8 to 10 minute windows are the time frame now that are challenging the companies coming on scene, going to work, compromising condition, structural failure, structural collapse, the maydays, and so forth. Or in the instance of one of the most recent reports, we're seeing very adverse fire behavior. So it may not be the building conditions affecting the structural integrity, but now due to the compactness of these structures, the size of our volumes of our rooms, the unique constrictions of the hallways within our structures, we're seeing the effects of fire dynamics that we're starting to learn more about. So there's these things that are challenging the status quo. Chief Shapiro.
I would apply that to new construction too, the way they're built nowadays.
Yeah.
This is the same approach for me. What are we doing to this place, and how much time do we have? Because, the solution to these new construction jobs is to knock it down and build a new one. Mm-hmm. They're not building them to withstand all this, all the insults and compromised structural integrity and all. They're not built for that anymore.
Well, it's interesting to note, and Chief Mulroy, I'll make mention of this comment here, and again, you can jump right in on how it's affecting Philadelphia. But when we take a look at the continuing trends affecting a lot of our metropolitan urban areas, whether it be Philadelphia, Hartford, the tri-state areas of New York, and so forth, the introduction of these larger footprint city square block types of structures that are now taking the place of all of our older, type 4, type 3 constructed buildings, or brick and joist constructed structures. And now we have these lumber yards with our podium construction, these multiple occupancy buildings. I know if we go through any of the areas in Kensington and Philly, many of those warehouses and the rowhouses all have been, removed. Actually, when the last time I was through Philly and I went over to York Street just to pay my respects, what's taken the place of what used to be there currently? It's all new construction. That is all type 5 engineered wood. And as Chief Shapiro just mentioned, it changes that tactical window. We just don't have that latitude. The buildings aren't going to perform differently, but yet across the street, sometimes you've got the old stuff, and on this side of the street, I've got all that new stuff and a whole different parameter of operations. What's your take on, and again, I think both of you started talking about the assumption of command based upon the ongoing evolution of an incident, based upon the arrival of a commanding officer, the deputy chief, and so forth. Let me go back to, again, some aspects on size up. Some of our larger metropolitan organizations have additional resources, whether it be a chief's aide or we have the depth of additional command staff to help support the incident commander. So assuming that you're the incident commander of that event and you have some delegation and some resources of staffing and support personnel, and we have other organizations that it's one man or woman, right? Whoever that incident commander is, they're the sole commanding officer. They may not have additional resources to help supplement recon or do the 360 or follow up on some of those aspects. What would be your perspective on how to gain additional building or incident intel with either having that resource or the absence of it? In other words, if you've got your resources, you're doing what? You're communicating to those additional resources, getting that communication and so forth. Number one, how effective is that communication? Is there potential for inaccurate information to come your way? And then in the absence of it, if you don't have it, how would you overcome that? How would you how would you try to get that additional building intel or fireground intel if you did not have those resources helping you out?
Well, that's a good question. Wow. If you didn't have it. I don't know. I mean, you got to do the best you can with what you don't have. But, for us, we have aides. We have additional companies. If you have companies in staging, you could put them to work just doing recon. Take a walk. Split your crew. Take a walk. What do you have here? What's it look like there? Do this, do that. Use what you have. If you don't have resources, that's a problem. You're going to have to figure something out on the fly.
Let me ask you this, though, Chief Shapiro. So since you've given some reply on that, would you let's say you're working a job and there's due to the commitment of staffing, although it may be unlikely, would you what would you personally do to try to attain that information? Would you personally do that 360? Would you go into an exposure? Would you go beyond the confines of a command post and engage into that fireground to try to obtain that information?
Yes, definitely. I generally never really stood by the command post, stood by the command board. I was always bopping around watching the evolutions, watching the operations, watching the crews, watching the progress. I was readily available. I was within visual contact of the command board. And we had people at the command board doing their thing. But for me, if I'm running this operation, I have to see what's going on. And I need to see it in real time. And, the companies are preoccupied with doing their tasks and their orders, and they're not looking at the big picture. And, the companies on the outside are doing their outside stuff. Somebody's got to put it all together and say, are we making progress? Is it getting bigger or smaller? Is the building falling apart, or is it, does it look solid? Somebody's got to be outside looking around and making sure that what you want to accomplish is actually being done. And we don't have the luxury of just throwing people at it all the time. We only have a limited amount of people. So sometimes it's beneficial for me to take a little walk, see what's going on, and compare what they're telling me with what I'm seeing. And tell them on the radio, that's not what I'm seeing. You telling me you're hitting it, I'm seeing something completely different.
Chief Mulray, what are your thoughts on piggybacking on Chief Shapiro? I mean, that is exactly where we've got to get. But let me ask you, and again, I deviate a little bit, but I want to the American Fire Service, and again, there's some different viewpoints of that, correct? We've got the stationary commanding officer that's out at the command board, won't go beyond, a couple of feet of that. And then we have another viewpoint where, again, there needs to be this degree of engagement, validating what we're seeing, what we're hearing, putting our eyes on it to give us a more complete perspective. But that continues to be a rather controversial, if not challenging, dialogue that sometimes takes place in the classroom, the training ground, and sometimes even on the fire ground. But
I'm not interested in
throw that in.
At the moment. I'm not really interested in the NFPA concerns as far as what the book says, or maybe my boss yelling at me because I'm supposed to be here instead of there. My primary concern is making sure those guys come out of that building alive and in one piece. That's it. We can go back to the firehouse and you can yell at me all you want about how I didn't stand at the command post, but everybody goes home alive and in one piece. Put the fire out. Let's get out of here. You get bogged down with process and procedure, and bad things happen sometimes.
Bingo. That's what I certainly wanted to hear. Chief Mulray.
And I'm being nice.
I know you are.
I'm being nice.
As we go up in rank from battalion chief to deputy chief, any time that I was not able to do a complete 360, it always had negative consequences to me and the fire ground. One of the things I think that we have a luxury of in Philadelphia is that we have standard operating procedures, and we put a pretty good amount of resources on every dwelling fire. We send 4 engines, 2 ladders, and 2 chiefs, along with a medic unit, to every dwelling fire. And one of the things as a battalion chief, you rely on the second in ladder company to go to the rear. The first and third go to the front, the second and fourth go to the rear. So your second in ladder is going to the rear. He's your eyes and ears in the rear until that second battalion chief gets back there. So then you get a second assessment. One of the things that we did as standard operating procedures when I first made battalion chief, and it was basically from talking to people who had a lot more time than I did and from my neighboring battalions, is we had a little standard that you would go to the rear, give a report, and then you would go inside. That's the second in chief. The first in chief would almost always stay outside the building in the front. One of the challenges we had in Philadelphia are how narrow the streets are. So, some of those narrow streets, you're only between the front of a dwelling that is the front of a dwelling across the street is only about 20 feet. And you don't really get a great picture of the fire ground. One of the things I would try to do, on streets like that is get a little further away from the building and maybe pick up an angle where I could see a little more of the front facade. Now that had positive and negatives. The positive was I was able to see a little bit better. But if I'm standing away from the building, you could see people arriving on the fire ground looking for me, not finding me, not calling me on the radio, and then taking action into their own hands. And you'd have to stop that once in a while.
Yeah.
But
you were doing something.
Right. Yeah, but they have to do something. The chief's not there because they don't see him.
You weren't at the corner bodega eating a bag of chips. You were doing something.
Right. Well, of course, it was because of the angle that I might have picked up. I might have been a little further away. I might have been on the porch across the street, right, elevated above so I can see what's going on. And that was something I picked up from the people that I worked with that had more time on than I did. They said, this is what we do. This is how, don't try to get right in front because you only see a limited amount of space. And, it's one of the hazards of being a chief. I mean,
well, there was some tricks that I would apply depending on the circumstances to make this run better. One of the things was our row houses butted up against a tree line. So there was only like a 10-foot yard and then trees. So you couldn't really get a company back there with an apparatus. And when you say throw some ground ladders just in case we need to get somebody, bail out, put some ground ladders up in the rear, the company officer would look at me and go, how am I supposed to get around to the back? Mm-hmm. Well, you only need to hear this once, but kindly go next door kick in the door and walk the ladder through to the backyard. Set it up and you're in business. But, that just comes from experience.
The other thing is each part of the city operates a little differently. So when I was in a ladder company in South Philadelphia, where the population density is, enormous and the streets are very tight, a standing operating procedure for the chief that I worked for was the second in ladder would go into service whether they were ordered to or not, because 9 out of 10 times they were going to need that ladder in the rear because it was such a hard feat to get that ladder in place. You knew it was going to take a lot of time. You couldn't wait for someone to tell you, because then you'd be behind the 8 ball, so to speak, and you would be trying to play catch up. So in that particular neighborhood with that particular chief, you knew you were going in service because that's what he wanted. He didn't have to tell you. He tells you that every day when he meets with you doing the rounds.
Yeah, same thing with me. Our orders were the secondary truck was supposed to stage until confirmed, given I used to tell the company officers, listen, just get in position like it's for real, because by the time I need you, I don't have time to wait for you to figure out how to get in position. Just pull up and get in position. If I don't need you, I can get rid of you.
Right.
But we're wasting time with this protocol stuff. Just get in position.
I think that's a very important point that both of you are making, that, again, there's this reluctancy to initiate some known actions that are going to be required, but companies are waiting for that, go into service, do this, do that, per the protocols, per the procedures, per this unwritten or written rule, right? Sometimes those SOPs are hard and fast, and the bosses expect don't initiate any actions until that you get the go-to consideration. And I think that's important when we talk about these types of housing stocks and occupancies and the subsequent challenges. There needs to be initiatives. There needs to be strong, and both of you are talking about this, very, very strong SOPs and SOGs that truly guide companies, but there has to be initiative at the company level to do the things that we know are going to occur based upon these particular types of structures in a particular battalion or division or area of a city and first due. Chief Mulroy, did you want to add anything further to that? Those were some exceptional, both of you, again, some very, very exceptional perspectives on some of these aspects here.
No, just in the absence of orders, our standard operating procedures kick in. So if the first in incident commander would say all companies in service and not give them any other instructions, we know the first and third to the front and the second and fourth to the rear. And that'll happen automatically and they will go in service. So it's kind of a fail safe for that. The only problem that you would really have is the command and control aspect of it. When the battalion chief shows up, he's responsible for the accountability. He's going to want to know where they are and what they're doing. And that kind of clashes a little bit, where the standard operating procedures clash a little bit with command and control. I never really liked that. And I would tell the company officer, hey, if you put everybody in service, that's great, but give them a specific assignment, and this way we'll be able to account for them. I think that's important. You got to know where your people are.
Yeah. What's your perspective on initiative versus freelancing when we talk about these conditions? And again, we're sort of leading down that particular path, right? And there's this fine line between sort of going off and doing your own thing and being that freelancer versus the initiative of actions based upon conditions. So what are your perspective as deputy fire chiefs based upon that gray area?
Chris, I got to mention one thing about initiative, sure. And it goes back to a train crash I had in 2015. And the initiative of the first in engine company to swing a U-turn on the street that we were on and stretch a 3-inch water line to the crash scene without being ordered was a great help. And it was, even though I had a little bit of knowledge about what we were doing and I knew the scope of what we had, I didn't think to tell that specific instruction to an engine company. And what that did is it made a guide path to safety for any of the walking wounded. We wound up treating about 200 patients. And the walking wounded were able to follow that water line. We never really used that water line, but it was a great initiative of the first in pump operator to do that. The ladder companies on this same assignment brought ladders to a train crash. And you think, what are we going to do with a ladder at a train crash? Well, these train cars are about 11 feet high, and when they're on their side, they're stainless steel. You can't get in the windows of them. You need a ladder. The ladder companies use their initiative. So you cannot squash initiative. What you do is, after the fact, you critique what we did. And if somebody went too far off the beaten path, you bring them back in and say, hey, maybe next time we don't, break every window in the third exposure, or whatever they do. You use it as a learning tool. You learn as a training opportunity, whatever you want to call it, to get better for the next assignment. But you cannot squash initiative, because that'll just it's cancer on the fire ground.
I think there's a pretty definitive line between initiative and freelancing. Initiative is taking initiative, seeing what needs to be done, and doing it more or less. Freelancing is just trying to find something to do, something more sexy, something more fun. One
way to justify whatever they did, I said, tell me what you did and just tell me why you did it.
That's exactly it. What's the rationale?
And most of the time they can convince me. I worked for a guy who was one of my mentors, very good fireground commander. And I would always try to put him on the spot about fires. We would meet every day, because he relieved me or I relieved him. And I would say, Mike, what would you do in this case? And he would say to me, plain out, Vince, I don't know what I would do. I wasn't there. I could tell you, what I would do on the fires that I went to. But if, he would never give me like a what if scenario. He would never give me advice on something because he wasn't there. He didn't see and feel what was going on.
Yeah. And a lot of times they just radio and listen, we're just standing here doing nothing. You got something else for us? Or maybe we jump up a floor and because a lot of times they just communicate that on the radio as opposed to just going and doing it. That's where you run into problems.
Yeah. Right.
Exactly. And if you don't want them to do it, say no, stay where you are.
Interesting. Some very good insights. Let me ask you guys this when we talk, again, going back to our rowhouse row frames. Again, from a command perspective, what are some of the benchmarks that you have found to be very critical or very useful in determining actions on the fire ground? So based upon your assumption of command, are there some specific benchmarks that you always were either listening for or observant to that would help in the management of that operation?
Of course, yeah. There's always benchmarks.
Well, what are some of the most critical benchmarks, and that based upon that, again, in these buildings? So if we're not hitting certain situations and the conditions and the incident sort of is running itself, the outcome is going to result in whatever, either positive or negative. But are there any critical benchmarks that you have utilized for these row houses, whether it be a single unit or multiple unit, multiple alarm fires, that you found to be critical in having a successful, uneventful in terms of injury or something more substantial of an outcome?
Well, there's just so many things to be aware of and so many things to look for. Always look for those indicators that things are not going as planned. How long have we been here? How long has the fire been burning? How much water are we putting in this thing? How many people we got in the building? Is the fire getting bigger or smaller? Is the building starting to come apart? Am I beating the snot out of the crews? They're on their second bottle, and I still got a lot of work that needs to be done. I don't have enough people. There's just so many things to take into consideration that, again, being the bad guy, because I don't mind being the bad guy. If I don't like the way this thing feels, get them out. Get them out. Go defensive. We can even start over if we had to. But to just keep throwing good after bad and hoping for the best and hope things change and, 5 more minutes, and you're just asking for trouble. And at the end of the day, what are we saving? As long as you can get, the victims and people who are maybe trapped, get them out, what are we saving? We used to go to these fires, 3 bricks. That was our common bread and butter operation, a 3 brick. If it was ripping, the DPW guy would say, listen, do whatever you want, but as soon as the sun comes up, we're knocking this place down. So whatever, have at it. So what are we saving? At some point, you got to look at the building and say, what are we doing? Why? We all want to be aggressive. We all want to be the superstars to save a building and this and that. But at the end of the day, for what? To kill a guy or a couple of guys?
Mm-hmm.
No. That's why I always tell new firemen, go to a line of duty death funeral. God forbid there is one, but go to one. Feel the gravity of that. See it up close, and you'll get a better appreciation for what we do out here. And when it's time for you to make decisions, you'll hold that close. Because, it's the job.
Yeah. Chief Mulroy, your perspectives?
I think the primary benchmark is the primary search and the secondary search. And even if you back that up a little bit, some of the intel you can gather from the sidewalk, just asking the people who are exiting the building, hey, is there anybody else in there? Sometimes you'll get a good read, sometimes you won't. But normally you can tell, and if you do have, say, I call it positive intel that everybody's out of the building, maybe you put that on the radio, put that out the radio. Hey, I got a preliminary report that everybody's out of the building, everybody's accounted for. It doesn't mean we're not going to do a primary and secondary search. It just means that the men and women who are doing that will take a little bit less risk. And you got to couple that with time. How long have we been there? I mentioned earlier, one of my benchmarks for primary, secondary search, fire knockdown was around 19 minutes. Once you cross past that, you're getting into, you're increasing your risk. And I think that's the one thing we got to look at. We could take a lot of risk, if we know people are in there and we get there early. But as we get later into the fire and we don't know if anybody's in there, I think we have to treat every response, as it is by reading the clues that are given to you. You pretty much, sometimes you could tell if there's cars in the driveway, there's people that should be in there. Where are they? If you have a little bit of intel that, hey, I think they're in there, that's going to increase the amount of risk we take. But at some point, the amount of risk we take has to diminish as time increases. That's it.
I think the common theme that we've been sort of touching upon, connecting the dots on throughout our conversation here, has been the element of time. And that time, whether it be a benchmark of a particular timestamp, whether it be 10 minutes, 15, or 20, is consistent with a lot of different parameters and methodologies and practices in building performance. Even Chief Shapiro, when you were talking about this aspect of the elapse of time, the degree of fire involvement, the commitment of personnel, the gallon per minute flow rates, live load, dead loads. I mean, these are all consistent with this aspect of time, which can be either compressed, and if we're not monitoring it, sort of can go out on its own. Let me ask you both this. How did you manage the specifics of time? In other words, there's conversations, there's protocols nationally, and NIOSH first started talking about the elapse of time on the fire ground in a much shorter context from what Chief Mulroy has been talking about in terms of the 20-minute rule. And then actually Chief Brunacini talked about this back in the mid-1980s, talking about fixed command positions and actually having a stopwatch. So how did both of you deal with the accuracy of elapsed time? In other words, 10 minutes of time may have gone on, 15, or Chief Mulroy, 20 minutes. How did you relate the accuracy of the elapse of time on the fire ground? Or how do the departments, I mean, is there a protocol that either one of your departments have or did not? I mean, back in the day, we didn't have anything, right? When we talk about operations in the 90s and 80s and so forth, we never really talked much about, we knew there was 20-minute rule. Nobody was really watching the clock. Some things were introduced in the early 2000s where we started managing them. Some jurisdictions actually implement protocols that the incident commander is given a communication, say, command, Alpha Command, you're 20 minutes into the operation, you're 10 minutes into the operation.
We have that. Hartford has that.
What did you have in your department that related back to the elapse of time?
Well, the dispatchers will they'll give you a kick every 5 minutes saying, 5 minutes have gone by, it's, another 5 minutes. They'll just remind you over the radio, over the incident channel.
And at what point did that clock be terminated? Did you have, as a commander, the ability to terminate the run clock? Yeah,
you could tell them, it's under control. We're doing overhaul, that kind of thing. Or you could just tell them to stop. But the command board also had a timer, a little timer. You could start the timer and see elapsed time. And I had an aide, so the aide was pretty cool at, keeping his own time. Like, he would listen for when the first due arriving engine got there, and he kind of make a mental note of what time it was. So, you figure a couple of minutes after that, at least they're going to start flowing water. So by the time we got there, you just do a rough estimate of how long they've been flowing water as opposed to what I'm looking at. And all right, well, that's definitely a determining factor of how we're going to proceed. It's all subjective, though. It just really depends on what's going on. And somebody starts screaming, victims and jumping out the windows, and you have all kinds of people hurt, and, companies are yelling and screaming. Maybe it doesn't sound like they're having a good time. You kind of forget what time it is, how much time has gone by. So you kind of just jot it down or ask the dispatcher, how long have we been here? Give me just give me a benchmark time, how long we've been operating.
And that's very important. Chief Mulroy, what's Philadelphia utilize?
Philadelphia has a standard operating procedure for elapsed time. The problem is that the elapsed time is the time of dispatch to the time the fire is placed under control, and that kind of ends it. It's really prompted with the first in battalion chief's progress report. That will start the first prompt of how many minutes. That'll be anywhere between 5 to 7 minutes. And then you might get it again at 10 minutes and then 20 minutes, and you'll continue to get it until the fire is placed under control. The only problem with that is the passage of information. So we have battalion chief's aides. I'm on the fire ground as a chief. I'm talking to my aide, and I'm talking to the companies on the fire ground. My aide is talking mostly to dispatch and maybe to anybody else outside the fire ground. If I need something, he'll call dispatch and have PICO or Philadelphia Electric show up, or the gas company or the water department. So the problem is, with him being overloaded for him or her being overloaded with information, he may not tell me, hey, it's been the elapsed time is 10 minutes or 20 minutes. We also have those little clocks on the command boards, but I don't think that it's been institutionalized to the point where we look at that. One of the things that I would use would be the computer-aided dispatch printout, which will have the dispatch time on it. Now, that's a manual system that I would use, but we would really rely on the elapsed time from the dispatcher through the field communications technician to the incident commander on the fire ground. And for the most part, it worked. It's a discipline item that has to be practiced every day. So it is part of your standard and part of your culture.
Yeah, it's certainly very critical. And again, some different perspectives, some different methodologies and such. I think it's important for our listeners to, again, understand, especially with our row house and row frame types of occupancies, conditions, fires, risks, and so forth, that you have to manage the fire ground in some degree of specificity dealing with time. Don't rely strictly on certain activities to be that benchmark. There has to be a reliance on either an internal or external clock. Whether you're watching the clock on your wrist or something at the command board, or more accurately, something that is coming from your communication center, the dispatchers, someone that's monitoring the clock at some interval, whether it be from time of dispatch, from time of arrival, from time of first line going in, or from first communication and size up. There's a lot of different processes across the United States, and all have pluses and minuses, but it's important for our listeners to comprehend and internalize and implement some type of mechanism to monitor the clock and monitor time, the elapsed time, because again, both of you have talked about that in a variety of different contexts, and it's so important because whether it be fire behavior, building integrity issues, operational issues, and so forth, time is not on our side in these buildings. And again, as they continue to age, the other aspects that come into play are going to create some conditions that are not recoverable. And that is the important part that goes back to our conversations a number of episodes back on predictability. All of our structures, again, although they are part of normally a series of multiple buildings that comprise either half the city block or sometimes an entire city block, that single unit has a small footprint. It has very specific type of construction, all of which will be impacted to some degree of severity by either fire or building age modifications and other conditions in there. And unfortunately, those conditions may not be recoverable. Again, the larger the building, loads can transfer, things can be picked up, fire can be contained to one part of a compartment or floor or area. But because of the compactness and smallness of our row houses, when fires affect one particular room, that may normally affect other related structural elements or other related areas in the building that create a series of cascading conditions. So a number of aspects. One of the things I want to sort of start leaning into our conclusion here is this. When we did some original research on row house fires, both from some near misses, some LODD reports, some other after action reports from a variety of resources going back all the way to the early 2000s, so over the last 25 years. And just based upon the data points that we had, 19% of the adverse conditions that occurred on the fire ground were related back to command, management, or operations. And the other 26% of adverse conditions occurring on the fire ground were related back to building construction and tactics. So tactics, construction, operations, and management and command represented 46% of the bad things that could occur or did occur on the fire ground, which is pretty consistent with what we've been talking about here in this in our conversation in our episode. So as we start winding down, we're just about at the termination point for our conversation, and we certainly could be talking about a number of things for another hour easily, just based upon what we've, I think, laid the groundwork out, and that is so important. We have just talked about foundation level insights, both at the command, the operational level, the management, the tactical perspectives, that leave a lot more for conversations and discussions. And that's what I want our listeners to walk away from, that we are just scratching the surface in this conversation as well as many of the other ones. And I really look forward to maybe picking up on this. I think the importance on this building type and occupancy risk and factors really need to be drawn out of the experience level that is represented by the American Fire Service and certainly by the two of you, your conversation, your insights, as well as our other insights on the front end of our program from both Chief Bastinelli and also from Chief Carroll out of D.C., talking about some of the similar aspects here. So just based upon some concluding comments, I'll start off with, I think I'll default to Chief Mulroy here. What would be some of your recommendations or experience, words of wisdom from your experience to the newly minted commanding officer, whether it be the BC or the deputy or district chief's level? What do you think you want to impart your experience in these building types and operations that would lend well for their potential growth and fireground management skill set level?
Chris, I want to try to work in a cliche. And one of the things that we've heard over the years was nothing showing means nothing. When you pull up on some of these firegrounds and you got to be ready to go to a fire. Somebody dialed 911 and called you to their house. And just because you don't see anything, it's not time to let your guard down. And I think that's one of the traps of the fire service. And you talked a little bit about making adjustments earlier. The second cliche I want to try to work into this, when you have, a bad event happen, the firemen will always say the same thing. It got real bad real fast. Well, we did something to alter that building. We pulled up with a building that had nothing showing, and then we opened the door and we injected some air in there, and it got real bad real fast. Again, you got called to a fire, you're on a fire truck, expect to go to a fire. The only other thing from the command perspective is to not get too close to the fire. The further away you are, you have a better vantage point of seeing more of the building and more of the fire ground. The closer you get, the less you see. It has some drawbacks to it, but it's something that I think is important. And you got to be visible to the troops, and you got to have a strong command presence. You know what I mean? You can't be rattled just because the house is on fire. That's what you're there for. That's basically it. But then, Chris, if I don't get the last say, I'd just like to thank you for the 2 decades of service that you've given to the Philadelphia Fire Department, coming out to every line of duty death we've had in order to build your knowledge base and help us understand what happened. I know you go back, I'm going to say 2 decades, it might be 3 decades, but I know you were involved in too many line of duty deaths in Philadelphia where you came down on your own time, and you helped me personally and a lot of other members of the fire department. I just want to say thank you before this ends tonight.
I just want to say thank you again. It's always been it's been a privilege for the department as well as for those that paid the sacrifice. So I want to thank you very much on that. And I want to also say again, Vince, you've done an exceptional job in promoting the lessons and learnings from Philadelphia on the national scale, both at FDIC and many other conferences, both locally and regionally and nationally. So again, this is why, and again, Chief Shapiro and I were talking before we actually got going here. This is why we do what we do here. This is trying to further along what we've all gained insights and experience on, the hard lessons, to make the job better and try to reduce that risk that's always going to be inherent for the next generation, the current and the future generation of the fire service. So thank you very, very much, Chief. Much appreciated. Chief Shapiro, I'll have you sort of close us out here.
Mm-hmm. We're talking to new officers or new incident commanders. Is that pretty much the audience to pass something along? I have 2 things. The first is, once you're in this type of a building, actually any building, but particularly this type of building, once the fire is knocked down, you got to do a complete reassessment of what's going on. This is the dangerous time. The fire, it's nice and it's exciting, but once you remove the fire, you have a different dynamic now. You're dealing with something that changed right in front of you. So you have to do a complete new size up. You have to reassess exactly what the building looks like, what the structure looks like, how it feels, how it sounds, what was done to it, and make your decisions based on that. Because things have changed, and now we need to figure out how to proceed. And the other thing is, I'm going to get philosophical here, but you, as an incident commander or even a company officer, you really have to understand your enemy. And the enemy is not the fire, it's the building. You have to understand the building and what it's made of, how it's put together, and what happens when you start taking those Jenga pieces out, whether from fire or rot or just, weakening. What happens when you start changing the dynamic of the building? And what to expect. You really have to appreciate building construction and know it intimately. And how do you get there? Go find a building. Get your way inside the building one way or another. And look around. Take some pictures. Talk to the guy who runs the place, the building manager or whatever. Go to a construction site and bend their ear, how they're building these things. Go down to City Hall to the records department and see, what they have all kinds of resources at the records department, pictures and prints and blueprints and stuff. Just get really familiar with this because it's the same theme over and over. Whether you go out to the building that's on fire or the building's somehow compromised from a storm or a rain event or a flood event, the building is the building is the building. It's a matter of what happens to that building. That's the real rub. You got to know what's going on with the buildings and what to expect. And everybody's focused on fire and fire dynamics. Yeah, that's what we do, but the enemy is the building. That's what's going to kill you.
No, better said. And again, that's those are actually some of the words of the late Chief Tommy Brennan. Talked about making the building behave, and again, a whole aspect of construction that has been a common theme on this podcast, and it's really a common theme for many of us that are into that whole perspective. So I'll just make mention of this for our listeners. 3 very prominent and significant line of duty death reports. Chief Mulray gave us some firsthand insights. I'll just draw your attention again when we talk about a couple of these things. Take a look at NIOSH Report F 2018-2018-03. That is the report that we've been referring to for the North Colorado Street fire that occurred on January 6th of 2018. So that is first and foremost. There is a tremendous amount of insights that are available out of that report that we've talked about, and even in additional some insights. And then the other 2 more recent reports that I would encourage you to download. Again, I'll just leave it at this. Take a look at these 2 reports. Again, very dramatically different types of row houses, both occurring in the city of Baltimore, Maryland. The first dealing with an abandoned, derelict, 3-story row house fire. This occurred on January 24th of 2022, resulted in a triple line of duty death. That report is F 2022-01. That was published in April of this year from NIOSH. And then the second report out of Baltimore was the double line of duty death. Again, predominantly dealing with fire behavior related conditions, but led to the line of duty death of a lieutenant and a probationary firefighter during initial fireground operations and the extension of that hose line. That occurred on October 19th, 2022. So 2023, I'm sorry. So 3 very prominent reports. I would encourage you to download those, get some insights, reach out to any of us for some further insights. Chief Mulroy, I'm certain, again, if those listeners that are out there take a look at the Letourneau report and ask some questions, they should be able to find you pretty easily online or again, reach out. We'll get you there put you in contact with Chief Mulroy or Chief Shapiro and so forth. So again, my appreciation to both of you. An exceptional episode here, some great takeaways. For those of you that are listening to this episode, I would listen to it at least 2 or 3 times over because there's some takeaways here that are exceptional and that are spot on. They are consistent with the message in all of our series that have led up to this program. Our 5th and final episode is coming up in the August timeframe. And again, we expect to wrap that up with some insights on one particular report, but we'll just leave it at that, sort of leave you hanging in anticipation. So Chief Shapiro, thank you very much. Chief Mulroy, again, as always, my appreciation. For our listeners, thank you so very much for listening in, especially on this extended two-part series. Again, we had our first part, which was our first alarm assignment for our episode, and then the second alarm, which was a great way to close it all out here. Guys, thank you so very, very much. Again, until next time, companies are in quarters and off the air. Stay safe. Keep in mind there's a job being worked somewhere in the streets, in your city, across the country, around the world, doing what we do best and being who we are, and that's firefighters. Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you very much.